Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Well, everyone here could probably hear me fine. Nadia, are we good online? Super. Thanks everyone for coming to this round of the Biodiversity Seminar. I'm really excited to introduce Jacqueline Oehri. Jacqueline is a postdoc right now at the University of Zurich. She did her PhD on biodiversity ecosystem functioning with Pascal Niklaus, and then worked on the surface energy budget and how it's affected by vegetation in the Arctic. I'm speaking too quickly with this mask on, sorry. Then Jacqueline did a postdoc in Canada with Andy Gonzalez and worked on habitat connectivity. And that's the work that she'll be presenting today. So I will hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me as well? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Really, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor. Like, you are my old lab colleagues from University of Zurich. It's so nice to see you again. And it's my first time at VSL, so it's really beautiful place you have here. So yeah. Today I will tell you something about including habitat connectivity in species distribution models for biodiversity conservation. And as Merin already said, I'm based now at the University of Zurich in the lab of Gabriela Scheppmann-Strub. But the work I present to you today was the collaboration that I had with Andy Gonzalez, Brian Liang, and Sylvia Wood in Canada. I spent 2 years in Montreal there. I had a very cool postdoc position that was founded by this MyTex Foundation that wants to accelerate transfer of knowledge from science to society. So they funded postdoc positions kind of at the interface between university and public or private sector. So I was 50% based in the labs of Andy and Brian at McGill, and also 50% I spent at the environmental research spin-off that Andy also co-founded. It's called Habitat, and they are consulting for biodiversity and connectivity conservation in Quebec, mostly in Canada, or further. So that was really cool that I think my whole postdoc there was also meant to try to make science also applicable in the practical sense, in practice. So, and the reason why habitat connectivity and biodiversity is this. So maybe you know this map of Locke et al. It depicts the 3 global conditions for biodiversity conservation. And I think maybe the only thing that you can, or one of the things that you can take from this map is that around 3/4 of the world's of the ice-free terrestrial surface are heavily influenced by human activities, and among others, we have habitat fragmentation. So the reduced area, the increased isolation, and the increased edge effects of species habitats going on in these areas. And this, among others, poses a threat to biodiversity and also reduces connectivity in the biosphere. And connectivity, which can be defined as the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. So connectivity is really important for the persistence of biodiversity. So probably I don't have to tell you this in too much detail, but yeah, species and organisms need to be able to disperse, to migrate, to find resources of food, to reproduce, to maintain gene flow, or to track climate in the times of climate change. Also, connectivity is important for landscape ecosystem functioning and resilience, and also for the access to nature's contributions to people. So connectivity is very important. However, it is often not considered in conservation management. So if you think, for example, of the Global Biodiversity Framework that was just almost 2 years ago reached in Montreal, the Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework, they have a lot of targets, also including promoting or safeguarding connectivity, but there is not yet agreed upon headline indicator how to actually measure if we reach connectivity targets or not. Then there is another map or another few studies actually show that if we look at the global protected area networks, only about 10% of the global terrestrial protected area network is structurally connected via intact land. And this is a little bit, the map is of a bit previous study that just shows you many red areas that are maybe even below 5% of structurally connected protected areas. So that's maybe the setup for the first part of my talk, where I want to so that was the rationale for developing an approach to rapidly and meaningfully assess connectivity for a range of species and over large regions. And then the second part is maybe also motivated by the fact that actually connectivity is often not validated. Like a lot of connectivity studies assess connectivity, but then there is not really an assessment if you have ecological corridors, if species actually use these corridors, or if they are important for biodiversity, for example. So we see the increase in connectivity studies per year, and the proportion of studies with validation, not so much. So that's the second part of my talk, where I want to focus on including or testing the importance of connectivity for biodiversity change. That's the part with the species distribution models. So first part, just to show you what awaits you. So we have that's my first study, the rapid evaluation of multi-species connectivity in human transformed landscapes, and that was just published. And the second part is called the Biodiversity Monitoring System in the St. Lawrence Lowlands. And here we want to test the importance of connectivity for biodiversity change, but these are really kind of preliminary results, and I'm very happy if you give me some critical feedbacks on them too. So yeah, first study, yeah, just published. And yes, so how I think connectivity is a very broad concept, and it's okay because it can mean from migration to gene flow, it can mean many different things, and it plays out at many different scales of space, time, and even organization. So how can we, in the context, so I think this study was focused on how can we, in the context maybe of the coming global biodiversity framework or of these targets, have an approach that can maybe with as little data inputs as possible meaningfully assess if we do make progress for different regions or countries in terms of connectivity. So the thing was that we first realized that there are not really very agreed upon sets of indicators or well-established indicators that allow you to do so. So, and ideally for indicators to be informative or for assessment or for evaluation, if we make progress towards a target, they should be smart. So they should be specific, they should be measurable, they should be maybe achievable and relevant, meaning that they should be interpretable in terms of a specific target, and maybe also time bound. So that means that if we have a target, for example, target 3, conserve 30% of land, waters, and seas of the Convention of Biological Diversity, ideally, we should be able to follow maybe over time, how did that, does progress go towards this target? Are we on the green trajectory or are we still on the red trajectory, for example? Also, we should be able that for maybe different species or organism groups or family, kind of assess what is the trend or the status with respect to a given target. So most likely we have some species or some organisms groups that do already well. So maybe they are not such a focus of conservation priority, whereas others do really badly, for example. So And then the same thing, not only across species, but also across regions. Maybe we have some regions, I show you the region, the province of Quebec. Maybe in some regions we have a lot of progress towards the target, in some others not. And this can then inform us again for spatial planning for connectivity. So that's maybe kind of the type of indicators that we were searching. And so we did a literature review and found 68 connectivity indicators currently employed to measure connectivity. And out of these, we kind of synthesize or summarize a key set of 6 indicators suitable to guide rapid action. So that can be maybe calculated based on minimal data inputs and still be generalized for or applied for many different species or ecological contexts. And that can be interpreted in terms of conservation targets. So the first one is the meta-population capacity indicator, which is, so in green here, I tried to draw a habitat network consisting of patches and corridors. And this indicator is based on a meta-population model based on dispersal capacities and extinction or source sink dynamics. It can kind of approximate the long-term species persistence with a given dispersal capacity and the given reliance on patch size, for example, for extinction or colonization. So it can highlight, so it can be biologically interpreted. So that's why we thought, and it introduces a long-term persistence view. The second one is the equivalent connected area index. This one is, we thought it's really important because it can be interpreted as the size or the area of the habitat that is effectively connected or effectively reachable by a given species, assuming a given dispersal capacity. Yeah, and so especially for the area-based conservation targets, this might be a nice indicator because you can interpret it in terms of area accessible to the species. And then we have the fraction of connected habitats. This is basically the effectively connected habitat divided by the actual habitat, and it can also help more for conservation priorities. Where do we have habitats that is not connected, or is all the habitat that we have actually connected? And then we have the betweenness centrality and node degrees. They highlight stepping stone functionalities of specific patches. So this is maybe also more in a spatial conservation priority setting context. So these are the indicators. And then we also developed this Reconnect approach and R tool that you can also access on GitHub. And I'm very happy for you if you want to test it and report any bugs to me, because I only tested it within my studies. So yeah. So, and it's based actually on these 4 steps. So the whole approach. And steps 1, 2, 3 can be done with the Reconnect R tool. So basically from a habitat map or also a land cover map, and we can actually extract for several species with different habitat needs or dispersal capacities at the same time, networks of habitat networks, and from these networks we can calculate connectivity, many indicators at the same time. So it works with a moving window approach, because if you ever try to calculate connectivity for very large networks, you realize it gets exponentially challenging to compute, and also maybe sometimes it's not so meaningful to always look at the whole network. For example, if we are in Quebec, maybe it's not so important if my patch here is connected to a patch in Alaska, but maybe I think also that's a discussion about the right scale that is relevant for connectivity. I think with these moving windows, you could increase or decrease the window size and overlap. And within these windows, you can extract then different networks for different species and calculate different connectivity indices. Then you can mosaic these results together into maps of connectivity that can already maybe help you for spatial prioritization or to spatially see where connectivity is high or low. But I would argue that for really, if we want to move into this area where we want to assess if we did progress towards a target, we need to be able to not only have our connectivity is high or low, but more like, is it high enough or is it critically low? We need to have an evaluation. So ideally, we would have something, for example, how we do this here, how we did this in this study is that for each species, we kind of rank the connectivity for a specific region. And so we can actually see the species that are doing well or the species that are not doing well. So it allows us to disentangle this. And so, we applied this approach to the St. Lawrence lowland. That's a priority area for conservation in Canada. It is located here in the lower part of the province of Quebec. It consists of different kind of biogeographic regions, the upper St. Lawrence Plain, middle St. Lawrence Plain, the Ottawa Plain here, the Montérégie and Montréal regions. These are just regions that are of conservation interest, or also maybe to show you how you can aggregate for different regions the connectivity results. You see we have a lot of agriculture and a lot of urban areas here and more forest areas up here. The landscape looks a bit like this. Actually, the size is maybe 30,000 square kilometers. So it's maybe 3/4 the area of Switzerland. But it's maybe more like Switzerland is much more heterogeneous on the same area. So it looks a bit like this. The landscape. And what we did was to select actually a previous study already identified a set of 7 species that are representative of regional forest connectivity needs. So that span a range of needing large patch sizes but being able to disperse very far to needing very small patch sizes but also being only able to disperse very short distances. So we have different habitat needs, also deciduous versus coniferous forests, and then also dispersal capacity. And so what we did was we applied this Reconnect tool. And what we could do is for each patch of habitat, we could calculate, for example, the contribution to metapopulation capacity of that patch, or the node degree, or the betweenness centrality. And we also, in this study, we compared always with the patch area and the habitat area to have a comparison. How do connectivity and area actually correlate or change? And so this is now normalized and averaged for all the species, for all the 7 eco-profile species. So, and the same thing we can do also at landscape level, where we can see where are landscapes with high metapopulation capacity or equivalent connected area, where is the fraction of connected habitat very high, and also where is the habitat area very high. And the nice thing about this is also that, maybe. That's now maybe informative for the spatial prioritization, but it doesn't really tell us a lot of how well are we doing compared to a specific target. And so for these regions on the x-axis, so the upper, middle, St. Lawrence Plain, Ottawa Plain, Montérégie, and Montreal region, we can now extract what is the total amount of habitat here as a fraction of the area of the region. And so just for as an example, I put here the line of 30% as a possible target, and we can actually see which species are doing well and which regions are doing well. So we have the grand mean or the overall mean here in black with the standard errors of the mean, and we have the different species over here. And so that's just the total habitat area. And if we look at the equivalent connected habitat area, we see that it is lower than the habitat area. So actually, only in the Ottawa plain for a few species, we would meet that target of 30% well-connected land. Yeah, also we can do this for metapopulation capacity or the fraction of connected habitat. And more interestingly, also higher, that's also, the 30% is only reached in the Ottawa plain. And so what we can do is not only the status that I show you here, but also the temporal trend over a decade. So we can do the same thing. We can see that over from 2011 to 2021, we have metapopulation capacity, patch importance, as well as patch areas decreasing in a large, for most of the patches actually. And we have betweenness centrality and node degree increasing. So betweenness centrality sometimes decreasing of up to 400. So kind of highlighting that well-connected patches maybe even become more well-connected, important in the network, whereas isolated patches rather become more isolated. And we can do this in the same way for the landscape level. We can see that for the connectivity metrics over here, it's rather a decrease everywhere, whereas for habitat area, the pattern is more nuanced. And again, we can also then aggregate these trends for different regions and species. And we can see that overall habitat area slightly increased, but actually this increase was not statistically significant. So almost no change in overall habitat area overall, although for example, for the black bear here in the Middle St. Lawrence Plains, it decreased a lot. However, the equivalent connected area overall decreased. Same thing, the metapopulation capacity also decreased overall by almost 20% to its previous value from 2011. And also the fraction of connected habitat decreased. So we see a decrease in several landscape connectivity indicators despite a slight increase or despite a stable habitat area. So in our case, the trends in habitat area and connectivity were not correlated or not, yes. And the same thing we can also do with the patch area. We can see overall the mean patch area decreased, the mean node degree and betweenness centrality increased, and also the metapopulation capacity decreased. Actually showing again, maybe this pattern of habitat fragmentation, of decreasing patch size and maybe increasing isolation. Yes, so that's the summary of this. So the 30% of connected habitat is only reached for some species in the Ottawa, in one of the regions that we looked at. We have seen, or our approach was also able to identify that we have a decrease in landscape connectivity despite a slight increase in habitat area, and we have a decrease in patch area, an increase in betweenness centrality that capture the phenomenology of the habitat fragmentation. So take home, area-based conservation alone might not safeguard connectivity. And so, and now we can move to the second part. That's about the biodiversity monitoring system in the St. Lawrence lowlands. We wanted to see now, because also, as you realized, also we did not validate connectivity in our previous studies. We thought maybe it would be nice, so we contribute again. But yeah, so that's why we tried to include them in, or we thought it might be cool to include them in species distribution models to see if actually places that we predict to be very well connected also maybe harbor more species, or kind of test the importance of connectivity in species distribution models. So And connectivity and species distribution models, these two things have been combined already quite some time. But I would argue that often it is actually an a priori use of species presence data to derive connectivity from SDMs. So it's not necessarily to test connectivity in its predictive ability for species presence, but more that we have data of species occurrence. Then we build SDM. We derive a habitat suitability map, which can be converted to a landscape resistance or inverse permeability map. And based on this kind of inverse predicted or habitat suitability or inverse habitat suitability that can be predicted from the SDM, we can combine it with a dispersal model, for example, from circuit theory, and we can identify the ecological corridors, kind of from most likely corridors from given species occurrence data, which is very fine. I think it's very useful, but I think the thing here is that here in this case, ecological connectivity is maybe not independent of the species occurrence data, so it's not so easy to test. So we wanted to do we wanted to use connectivity as predictors of SDMs to test if we can actually predict using the connectivity information, the species occurrences. So that's maybe a very famous diagram that you all know very well, that I modified from Vasudev et al. And just shows you that a species occurrence or maybe persistence in a place, it depends on abiotic conditions or environmental factors. It depends also on the movement capacity, so on the ability to reach that place, and also on biotic interactions. So what I will cover today is only this part. So the biotic interactions, I leave it up to you or to Merin to do this complicated task. Yeah. So again, we thought we can use the St. Lawrence lowlands, and actually it was also because I was working at Habitat and they wanted to have a biodiversity monitoring system. So they wanted to be able to know where is the species richness and where are connectivity corridors to make better recommendations when they did the environmental consulting for their clients. And because we already knew how to calculate connectivity for this area, I think this was a very low-hanging fruit. So the idea was that we use information about abiotic conditions and information about movement capacity or connectivity and combine it with species occurrence data. We try to do this with open access GBIF data because also we wanted to have something that might work with data that is available almost globally and does not depend on specific very high level monitoring data that sometimes is not available. So just in some countries, for example. And so, yeah, kind of to predict species occurrence at the time t. But because I was working at Habitat, I think we wanted to also do this thing that you can update your model predictions as new data comes along. And so we wanted to build this biodiversity monitoring system that can have maybe from time to time new predictions about species occurrence and connectivity change by including new data as time goes by. So to have this iterative workflow. And because GBIF in Canada has most of the good quality records in GBIF are birds. Now we did focus on bird connectivity. So similarly as in the previous study, we tried to identify kind of eco-profile or movement profile species that cover a range, you know, of eco profiles, kind of species with low dispersal capacity and small patch size requirements, or species that can disperse further but need maybe larger habitat or contiguous patches to be called habitat. So that's why we based this on you see this dispersal capacity, short or long distance, and patch size requirements that we derive from a species specialization index developed by Martin and Farik. We can talk about this also. But so the kind of eco-profile species, we also wanted to do this for two different habitat types, for grassland and forest species. So we have the grasshopper sparrow, the upland sandpiper, the common nighthawk, and the savanna sparrow, the black-billed cuckoo, the olive-sided flycatcher, the wood thrush, and the Baltimore oriole, that as our eco-profile species. And then, so we had the years 2014, 18, and 22 as three example time points. We had these we calculated the connectivity layers of these 8 forest and grassland eco profiles. And then we had the occurrence records in GBIF. We only selected the forest or grassland bird species from GBIF. So that's, we did thanks to this very nice database, the AVONET database, that has many traits, species traits for birds in there. So, and for each species in GBIF at time t, we first estimated trait similarity to one of these 4. For example, if it's a grassland bird, then estimate trait similarity to these 4 eco profiles. Then create one connectivity layer. So first aggregating the different connectivity dimensions of the eco-profile species into one, and then also based on the trait similarity, weigh it for each species in GBIF separately. Maybe that's a bit complicated, but maybe for each time and species, we created one layer of connectivity based on these 4 eco-profiles in the specific habitat type group. Then we also fitted an environmental niche model. We used random forest and GAMS. And we used basically all temperature, climate, elevation, vegetation index, land cover information. So all environmental variables that are not connectivity, basically, and created a layer for predictions coming from these environmental niche models. And then we plugged it in a structural equation model. So I think the idea was that we wanted to be able to see if environmental effects maybe are mediated indirectly via connectivity to affect species occurrence or predict species occurrence. We also included the species occurrence prediction from the previous time in the model to see how much is already explained by the previous information. And we also included the change in connectivity because we have seen that change in connectivity is happening, and maybe this is maybe more important than connectivity per se, because it could maybe highlight a recent disturbance or recent change. And so from this, on one hand, we wanted to have predictions. So for example, the rough-legged buzzard predictions for the year 2022 based on the STM or based on the structural equation model, including connectivity. So we wanted to, with this also to detect change in biodiversity, but also have somehow means to have this causal inference or to attribute, maybe deriving from the SEM, the standardized path coefficients, where we can see direct and indirect effects, for example, mediated by other variables. And so that's the very preliminary results. I mean, I think, and that's also, I think, for example, at Habitat, this was also a focus because they wanted to be able to see or to give recommendations where is species richness predicted to be high or low, you can also combine these maps with trait data. You can, for example, have maps of where are the vulnerable species or the red list species located. So we created from all the predictions of the environmental niche and the structural equation model, including connectivity, we generated these presence-absence maps, and we use this prevalence threshold and stacked the species presence-absence maps. So we have this forest bird species richness and grassland bird species richness for these 3 time periods. And then also, we can assess the normalized change. So as you probably know, the GBIF data, they have increased observation effort that is almost exponential with years. So every new year we have more observations, so more species possible. So we could not have like the absolute value of species richness. So we have decided to have like the relative for each pixel, the relative species richness compared to the maximum in the whole landscape. And we can see how this relative importance for species richness changed spatially. And we can see that for forests, we have like a mixed picture. And for the grassland species, we have really dominating declines. And this is just a very simple first assessment of like all these pixels that show either increase or decline. And we see that actually the forest species tend to increase and the grassland species tend to decline. Yes, and so that was for the spatial aspect or the predictions. And now to the inference of drivers. So we using this structural equation model, we could assess indirect or direct effects of a variable to the species occurrence, indirect effects mediated by other variables. We could also extract the mediator effect of variables, for example, as the change in connectivity, and also the total effect. And actually, when we look at this, maybe just also in the interest of time, if we compare the environmental niche and the connectivity model, we have actually a significantly larger standardized effect size of the environment compared to connectivity. So actually environmental niche already or having a stronger or having a larger estimated coefficient for predicting the species occurrence. So that was derived from the fitted models that are kind of the coefficients. If we look at the predictive skill of the environmental and connectivity models, we can see, so the previous was done using the fitting subset or the fitting data, the data that was, or these coefficients are derived from the fitted models, right? And this one was derived by assessing using the normalized Matthews correlation coefficient. It's a similar measure as the ROC AUC measure, but they claim a bit better. And we used this validation data subset that was not used in fitting process. And we can see that actually with increasing time, the predictive skill of our models got better. Predictive skill was also just slightly better for grassland habitat. And here, the difference in model fit between environment-only model here and the whole structural equation model, I mean, it's slightly better for the whole structural equation model, but not significantly so. So actually showing already the environmental niche model might tell you the same thing. So implying a bit that connectivity might not be so important, but I think I want to highlight 2 points. So if we look at forest species and grassland species, if we look at the difference in fit or predictive ability of the models, including connectivity, increased model fit for 60 or 70%, depending on habitat type of the species. But actually most of the additional gain was very low, only for about 4 or 6% of the species. The improve in model fit was quite strong. So I think this could also highlight that maybe there are some species that depend on connectivity much more than others, and especially at the connectivity at the scale that we calculated it. So we have to definitely go much more in detail to disentangle this. So maybe there are species traits that can predict this dependence on connectivity or some other characteristics. So test the importance of connectivity for biodiversity change. We have seen that the path coefficients are higher for the environment-only model. The predictive skill of the environment plus connectivity models is slightly better, but not significantly so. And the predictive skill, including connectivity, is variable among species. And so possible drivers of this may be the traits, the right scale, the modeling that was, I admit, quite complex, maybe overly complex, trying to achieve too many things at once. But yeah, so I'm very happy to discuss this. But I think take home from the first part is that actually we see an ongoing loss of connectivity despite a slight increase in habitat area. So definitely accounting for connectivity and conservation has to be a separate thing from just having the area-based conservation. Then biodiversity monitoring system in the St. Lawrence lowlands. Connectivity as predictors in SDMs, we got mixed results, maybe they depend on species traits. Well, maybe the big take home for me, if we talk about biodiversity conservation in human transformed or other lands, I think often maybe as scientists we deal with large statistical data sets and statistical models, and I think we are often really focused on the mean trends or status, but often when it's about conservation, we are often actually interested in these species that are super rare or super vulnerable. And so we need to have approaches that can actually accommodate this and to actually have a more nuanced view of the trends and status and maybe identify the species or the regions that need conservation more than others. And so with this, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for a very interesting talk. I think we'll open up a round of questions. I would just like to ask you guys to wait until you have the mic, just so that people online can hear you. And also for people online who hopefully can see me, please just write in the chat and we'll make sure your questions are asked.
Thanks, great talk. I was wondering whether you tried to include directly the connectivity layers within the random forest again?
I did so in early stages, but then I think that's kind of because we wanted to have this causal inference, or we tried to separate maybe contributions by connectivity from the rest. I only made this model like in the final version, but I think it would be a very easy thing to do to just try to see if we can include connectivity as like the other factors in the random forest or GAM.
Because somehow you could try to infer causality by doing a spatial block cross-validation where you try with and without and then you compare the score.
Yeah, I think so too. I think this modeling frame, I think definitely I would need to, now after having seen this, I think I need to go back and try to do a simpler model. I think this was also part of a framework that Habitat also wanted to implement, or that was yeah. I think maybe this is so complicated in a way that I think it tries to fit several purposes. And I think to actually really get at the question, how important is connectivity for species richness or for species presence, I would do, as you said, maybe have an additional random forest with connectivity and compare it with the one without.
Yeah, maybe I go on because it's a related question. So the spatial range is basically very much dependent on the dispersal capacity of the species. So, and actually, I think in my understanding, the window size that you're talking about should be based depending on this dispersal range. Actually, it would be interesting to test whether you can relate the dispersal capacity of the species to the predicting effect of connectivity at the range, the scale you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Actually, I think those are very good points. First of all, I did assess or the dispersal capacity and adjust the window size accordingly. So you can have, for example, a distance where the probability of dispersal falls below 1,000 still, or any low number you would like to have, maybe, or below the significance threshold, for example. And so we did come up with window side length of around 16 kilometers. And what is very interesting, if you look at, you know, we also tested this with different window sizes. So first, we have, for example, 9,000 meters and 46,000 meters. So that's kind of a lower and higher than we had in our study. And what you also have to consider is that, I mean, that were very first tries, but you have like also the connectivity at different levels, you know, like the small windows, they can only capture connectivity that is very local. And the larger your window gets, you're maybe not able to see like important nuances in between. So actually having a large window is maybe not always better, because, for example, you have this at the patch level. You can see if you have the window that is too large, then you have the differentiation is maybe more between these two big areas that are actually at the large level. You see the ones in the bright colors on the right. They are really maybe the large important areas for connectivity. But if you are interested in conserving connectivity in this region, then maybe you would prefer maybe having, you know, more localized connectivity estimates. So it is really, I think, maybe not discussed enough that scale or considerations or definitions of what scale you choose can really affect the outcome of these analyses. And very probably we need to have multiple scale assessments, which and maybe also some species react more at smaller scales and others at larger scales. But I think we should have more discussions about how to choose these scales in a meaningful way. And I think, what did you say? Did I answer your questions?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was, yeah. I have many others, but I'll hand it over to others.
So I appreciate your attempt to validate this somehow. But I was also just wondering, given how much GBIF data there are, birdwatching data there are, if you couldn't even do it empirically, like, so some of these areas you highlight here as being, like in this particular map, as being potentially useful for birds, I guess a creeper there, then you could go and see if those species are actually found in these little patches, or there's Or maybe birders just never bothered going to these little patches, and so you have no information. So I don't exactly know if it would work, but I was just wondering, yeah, with this huge data, if you can empirically validate this a bit.
Yes, definitely. I think, yeah, I think this is really maybe a starting point, like a first assessment, how we could incorporate these connectivity layers into species distribution modeling. I was also considering, I mean, there are better data in Canada available from maybe from the breeding bird survey, or we could compare it with other kind of data to really see also to validate. I think I also was, when I did look through the slides this morning, I was also wondering maybe the focus on validation was maybe more kind of a motivation, but actually what we wanted to do at Habitat then was to have this biodiversity monitoring model and not necessarily only focus on validation, for example. But I think, yeah, that's another aspect that I definitely should do and take into account, or maybe more easy validation is possible with the data that exists already. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. You mentioned that traits could be one possible explanation of how would you test the traits? So by selecting species based on the different traits, what about multiple traits correlated?
Yes, I think I was aiming at maybe the first very straightforward way to do it would be to have the AVONET trait database, and we already have like things like that approximate maybe dispersal capacity, or also low or high reproductive rates, or species specialization index. So how adverse or how risky is the surrounding landscape for you, or so there are some traits that could give some indication. For example, so first thing I would do would just be to test if, for example, the predictive skill of the models was better for species with smaller dispersal capacity compared to species with larger dispersal capacity, or for species that are really more specialized on their habitat compared to generalists, for example. So I think there is a lot of that would be maybe my first way, direct way to do this. And then there are many other ways to do this as well. Maybe already, yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Or do you have an idea, or did you think about something specifically?
Anyone else? Oh, you have someone online? Oh.
Robert Pasur says, maybe you can do the validation on those species that are habitat specialists. Those are easy to see the isolation connectivity.
So I can do the validation on the habitat specialist. What was the second part?
Yeah, it's a suggestion, a comment. Those
Yes.
are easy maybe to see the isolation connectivity.
Yes, I think so. I think it's very interesting in this. I think that would be a first very easy to go to place. Definitely, I think that's a good approach. There is this paper by Martin and Farik et al. They found that they assessed the species specialization index for North American birds, basically trying giving kind of a score how specialized species is to their habitat. And they found that actually the species specialists on average dispersed further than the species generalists, also because probably they have to, because their habitat's not so available. So I think that might be something that could conflate this validation with the specialists, because on one hand, yeah, they're maybe more threatened by extinction when their patches are isolated, but then there may be also less because in general, because they can disperse farther. So it's very complicated, and I think there are multiple trait interactions. And yeah, I think I would like to also, not only empirically test this, but also have like a good, maybe mechanistic model behind. That would be another way to test. Maybe go more into the direction of simulations to sort out a bit that chaos. Yeah, that would be the other way.
I think we have time for one last question. Otherwise, I have one, which is a bit broad and open. So you were looking at, in your first part, you had the 8 species?
Yes.
And I guess I see them a little bit like umbrella species for forests, right? And I was just wondering what your opinion was generally on using umbrella species. And if you have, of course, it's an issue of data availability as well, but if you had all the data in the world, are there other species that you would focus on or other approaches you would take?
I honestly think it is very meaningful to focus maybe on a few, on one hand, I think the scientist always wants to have the better model. And I think that's also an endeavor that is really important. But on the other hand, if you want to have something that is applicable and meaningfully interpretable for us, I think it makes sense to maybe decide, for example, on a range of habitat or dispersal needs, because even having, for example, 4 or 8, you can already, or it is maybe little enough that you can say, hey, actually the status or trend for the far dispersers and small habitat patch sizers is very good. We don't need to focus on them, but actually for the low dispersers with large habitat patch size, that's where maybe, so I think having some, but you have to maybe think of these criteria beforehand. What are the aspects that you can maybe also act upon in a conservation context, and what are maybe the important traits or characteristics that we need to be able to monitor. And I think that's sometimes more meaningful than having like all the possible models and data, and then in the end you still need to kind of, I think it's a balance of trying to be as simple as possible, but still like capturing for the purpose fit right characteristics. And I think having these kind of movement profiles or eco profiles could be, I think it's a good way. I'm not sure, but I would also need to test, like how to build these connectivity models for the other species. Yeah, but yeah.
This is on. Okay, thanks so much. I think we are just out of time. We will be going off for lunch. So if anyone wants to join us, please do. We have a table reserved. And I think your contact information was up there at some point. So there. Yeah, so feel free to also write Jacqueline. Thank you so much for presenting today. This is really interesting. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you.